I'm often asked by experienced leaders from all over the world. It's not unique to North America, Europe, Africa, Middle East, Asia, Latin America, it doesn't matter. Everyone seems to ask me questions about preparing for leadership transition, or sometimes what does the Bible say about retirement, or is it right or wrong for a minister of the gospel to even consider retirement? I want to talk about that today for a few minutes. I want to start with two stories. I heard directly from dear friends of mine who have served as mentors. One, a very close friend and a very close personal mentor, and another, someone I've met, but originally met him through his books and through his preaching. The first one is a man who's 86 years old and has served as a pastor, a missionary, a theologian, author of more than 50 books. If I mention his name or mention his books, I'm sure you've read some of his books. I hope you have. He retired a number of years ago to a beach and did a lot of fishing. And after a while, he didn't like fishing anymore and knew that he still had, as we would say, fuel in the tank to do more in ministry. And sitting in his apartment, he asked this question. He said, "Is there still a need for my ministry?" This man's in his mid-80s. There's still a stirring and a burning after trying retirement. There's still a stirring in his soul. And the question, is there still a need for my ministry? The other story, a quick story, is at the time this man was 82 years old. He's a well-known pastor, missionary with a prophetic ministry and a global apostolic voice. And in his early 80s, still traveling the world and preaching. And he made a statement that if I stop preaching, I'll probably die. Some people get on all types of medical machinery to keep them alive in old age. This man, his machinery, it wasn't anything about his lungs or his heart or any of that. It was preaching. That was what kept him alive in his mind. And he said, I'm called to preach. God made me a preacher. Everything I've done my whole life is preaching, and if I don't do that, there's no reason to be alive. That was sort of the conversation, not a quote, but a conversation. And so there's two different ideas here. One, retired, but still felt this calling and this message from God to get out to people. The other has no theology of retirement and will never retire. He will preach until his last breath. I want to look at a scripture when we think about the idea of preparing for leadership transition, or sort of a different topic is retirement, preparing for retirement or not. And the younger of these two men in their 80s always talks about, he kind of mocks retirement and says, retire, no, I'll refire. And this is a guy with a lot of fire. He's 20 years older than I am and has twice the energy that I do. So he's definitely figured out how to refire. I want to look at Ephesians 4 because it's hard to talk about leadership transition. It's hard to talk about preparing for the latter stages of leadership among established senior leaders without looking back at the call of God. In fact, I can't discuss finishing well without understanding the calling that started us from the very beginning and has sustained us throughout. We start with a call from God, we live the call of God out, we finish with a call of God. So I don't know how to talk about leadership transition, preparing for the future as senior leaders or even retirement without rooting it in the call. So let's look at this. Ephesians chapter 4. I'm going to read just the first 4 verses, and I want you to look as we read the phrase call or calling 4 times in here, and then we'll look back at that. I, therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of your calling, to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope that belongs to your call. There are 4 phrases in this passage where Paul mentions calling, and he's in prison. He's appealing to the leaders and the church members in Ephesus to live right, to walk right, to honor God, to live the way they should. And he roots that in the call. And as he appeals, he reminds them of the call. Here are the 4 phrases. He says the phrase, worthy of your call. Then he says the phrase, you have been called. Have been called, not you're trying to get called or you're trying to do something that would merit a call or earn a call or something like that. Have been called. The next one, this phrase comes up, you were called. So worthy of the call, walking worthy, you have been called, you were called, and then that last one is this idea of your call. And that last phrase, he says, the hope that belongs to your call. And he personalizes it at the end. It's not just any general calling. There's a general call for all Christians, but now he's zeroing in your call. There's the specific calling that we have to tap into. There are 4 questions that help me understand my call, and maybe it'll help you understand your call, especially in this context, as whether you're an emerging leader or whether you're an experienced leader, you're an emerging leader just now taking off the runway of leadership, or you're an experienced leader. At some point, you're going to land on that runway, hopefully not as another's taking off and having one of these runway crashes, but there's a landing and a taking off. Whichever part of that you are, there are 4 questions that all throughout my life have helped me embrace and understand and live the calling the best I can. First one, who am I called to be? Who am I called to be? For the Apostle Paul, he was a teacher of Old Testament Scripture. He was a Pharisee. But when he encountered Jesus, he also encountered a call, and he was called not any longer to be a Pharisee, but he was called to be an apostle, a sent one. And you understand his calling, and it started there when he understood it. For me, I look at the core of who I'm called to be, and my calling of who I am supposed to be starts with being a Christian, a follower of Jesus. It has to do with being a husband to Deborah. It has to do with being a father to my sons and a father-in-law to my daughter-in-laws and a grandfather to my 7, almost 8 grandchildren. I just may have prematurely let something out there to the whole world, but you guess who. That's who I'm called to be. And then a part of that, not the front end, but a part of that is I'm called to be a teacher and preacher of the gospel. So the starting point of understanding the call is, who has God called me to be? And this is what he's addressed here. You walk worthy of that. Here's who you're supposed to be. Now live like that. Lean into that. Live in a way that honors that and is worthy of that calling. Secondly, is what am I called to do? And we can follow Paul's writings and Luke's writings in the book of Acts and see what Paul was called to do. It was a missionary call. It was a church planting call. It was an establishing church call, a teaching and preaching and straightening out theology and bad doctrine. And there was a lot of that. That's what he did. And so for me, I start with who I'm called to be, and then what am I called to do? For me, the doing part in the earlier parts of my ministry, what I did was campus ministry. Later on, that evolved into campus ministry / church planting when I moved to Asia, and that was really what I did. Later on, that evolved into pastoring and leading a church that did a lot of global mission, and I'm no longer a pastor of a congregation. I haven't been for about 12 years now. And what I'm called to do these days in the latter part of my ministry has everything to do with leadership. And I see it like this. What I'm called to do is identify potential leaders. It's to develop future leaders. It's to empower emerging leaders. It's to coach experienced leaders so they can finish well, and so they can land on that runway when it's time to land, and they can still live powerfully fruitful, strong lives as leaders. So we talk about, who am I called to be? What am I called to do? The third question is, where am I called to serve? Where? It's not the same for you and the other person sitting next to you, unless that's your husband or wife. Where am I called to serve? I started out serving on the Mississippi State University campus. Then it was Manila's university belt, and then it just from there to other places, and now I'm called to serve from primarily Nashville, but to the world. Whether that's through Zoom or whether that's through Delta Airlines. But all of us, to understand the call, there's who am I called to be? What am I called to do? Where am I called to serve? And then finally there's, how am I called to serve? How? Again, Paul served through evangelism, through teaching right doctrine and correcting wrong doctrine, through church planting and establishing churches, and then moving on in a pioneer apostolic mission sense and doing it all over again. I know for me, the how has evolved over the years. From how, it was through campus ministry, then through church planting and global mission, then through writing, and there's various ways that the how has changed quite often in my life, and probably in yours. In fact, number 2, number 3, and number 4 probably will change as you grow. What you do will change as you grow. There was a time when I was a pastor of a local congregation. I'm not that now. It changed. Probably with you. As you go to the nearing the runway to land, what you do probably changes. Where you are quite possibly could change. How you serve probably has to change. What doesn't change is ultimately who God's called you to be. Starting with His child, His son, His daughter. The who part is pretty much permanent. There are things that are added to it. When I became a grandfather, then the who I am, that identity changed a bit. Something was added to it, nothing was taken away from it though. So I hope that helps understand as we think about nearing a finish line of ministry, not quitting ministry, and we'll get to that in a moment, but nearing, then hopefully that'll help you understand the calling, because it is rooted in calling, and Paul's appealing and saying, live worthy of that calling from start to finish. That brings up the question of retirement, and that's the question I'm often asked, what I think about that. I can't think about it outside of the context of calling. And since I believe the calling is a permanent thing, then perhaps we need to redefine what we mean by retirement in a ministry context. The average age of a S&P 500 CEO's retirement, okay, these are big corporations that you would know the names of many of them. The average age that a CEO retires is 58 years old. 58. Now, if we look at mega churches, at least the studies done of American megachurches, and it might be similar worldwide. I've actually seen some data from Chinese megachurches or megachurch movements, networks of underground house churches that end up being just multiplied more people than a typical American megachurch. The numbers of retirement or passing the leadership baton and all that is much older in the Chinese churches. So I've seen data for both, so we're probably somewhere in between those. But while the average CEO of an S&P 500 company retires, the average at 58 years old, the average Western American megachurch retires in their mid-60s at 65. And there are many cases where they lead into their mid-70s and 80s. And the data I read with the Chinese churches leans heavily toward the 70s, 80s, and sometimes beyond that. Why is it that people in ministry tend to hold on to a position longer than those in the business world? There are a number of reasons, and it's actually quite logical. Part of it has to do with finances. Typically, in a CEO of a major corporation has a lot of money, and there's what they call a golden parachute. When that man or woman retires, they don't really need to work anymore. They have plenty of money, and they might They might go on and work in other areas. They probably don't retire to the golf course, but retiring from that position. They're usually financially well off. Unlike in ministry. Ministry, they're typically not well off and typically need to continue having an income no matter where they are in the world. And so financial pressures, which is why it's so vital that as we start thinking about leadership transition, financial preparation from the very beginning is an important aspect of being able to step out of a position and yet continue to minister. Another reason that in ministry people tend to hold on longer than in the corporate world, unlike most other professions, the vocational minister finds much of their identity wrapped up in what they do. Also in ministry, because especially the way we do ministry, it's very relational. We see it as a spiritual community, a spiritual family, as something beyond just a job. And so very often the social circles of a senior pastor and senior leaders in the spiritual world, their social circles are wrapped around their position, unlike in the corporate world. That's usually not the people under the CEO or not the people they socialize with. It's usually other CEOs. And so when they step out of that position, they still have these other friends. Whereas in ministry, when you're no longer the pastor or the senior pastor, there's really quite a season of a strange type of relationship of identity and relationship with other people that doesn't make sense anymore. And where are those relational lines at that point if I'm no longer the pastor? But I think another reason people hold on in ministry to a position is maybe a misunderstanding of the idea of calling. And I think to clarify it, calling is not necessarily tied to a position. For instance, I no longer am fulfilling my teaching and preaching ministry by having a position as a pastor in the Victory Church family in Manila. I haven't been a pastor of a local Victory congregation for almost 15 years, but I still teach and I still preach. So the call on my life to teach and preach, for a season, I fulfilled that calling through the local church called Victory Manila. But when I no longer had that position, it didn't mean I no longer had a calling or an anointing or responsibility or stewardship to teach and preach. God opened up other avenues for that. And so I hope that makes sense. When we talk about retirement, we can retire from a position and from a role and from a specific place that we serve, but we don't retire from our stewardship. We don't retire from our calling. We don't retire from the responsibility to carry out the ministry. And this word that the Apostle Paul writes to Ephesus still has bearing on my life, even though I no longer occupy several positions that I used to occupy. I no longer have the positions that I had for decades in the church in the Philippines, but I still have a calling, and I still have a gifting, and I still have a responsibility to walk worthy of the calling, even though it's not being carried out in that position, it's being carried out in this position. So I might retire from a position, but I don't retire from God. I don't retire from the call and the gifting that He placed on my life. Now, some of you have heard me talk about the idea of the leadership runway. I'm writing a book called The Leadership Runway right now. The idea is succession planning and leadership transition with a metaphor of a runway. Some planes land, some planes take off the runway. And the safer we keep the runway, the better this whole thing works. There is the possibility of a crash landing. Sometimes planes crash land. Usually people don't survive when there's a crash landing. It's always better when we built a runway. Most pilots need a runway in order to land safely. Occasionally you'll find one that pulls off some miraculous thing, and that's why it's news, because people survived a crash landing. So when we think about the leadership runway and we build our ministry so that emerging leaders can take off, established leaders and experienced leaders can land, I want to give you 5 reasons that we land when we use this metaphor of a runway for our ministries and for spiritual leadership. The first one, the first reason we need a runway to land on is to refuel. There's nothing wrong when we need to refuel. It doesn't matter if you're an emerging leader or an experienced leader. We all need to refuel. And I think the question is, what do you do to refuel? I know there's the possibility of refueling in the air. I know in military exercises that happens. I was on the phone. I've been on the phone a lot since the Russia and Ukraine situation happened with our leaders in that area. They're working 24/7. There's no day off right now as they're serving refugees in a battle zone. There's no time to refuel. And so there is the grace of God in certain situations where we can go and kind of live on fumes. But in a normal life, we do need to land the plane of ministry and refuel so that we can take off again. So refuel, it doesn't mean anything's wrong if you need to refuel. Secondly, is the idea of redirect. On a recent ministry trip to Panama, I flew from Nashville, and I flew from Nashville east to Atlanta in order to go south to Panama. So I landed in Atlanta to redirect and go south because there was no direct way from Nashville to Panama to go visit the new church plant team. So sometimes we land in order to redirect, and that's very common in ministry. I've had multiple redirections in my life where I had to kind of press pause or land from my campus ministry at Mississippi State to redirect to Manila. And then there was a time when my focus on campus was redirected to mobilizing global missionaries from the Philippines. And there was a time when that was landed and redirected to various others. So you might be in a season, you might think it's retirement, but it could possibly be a redirection. You're landing and there's a new direction. Another reason planes land is to retool. Again, nothing wrong. If you need to refuel, nothing wrong. Unless you don't refuel, then there's a problem. If you need to redirect, nothing wrong, unless you keep going the wrong direction, and then you end up somewhere you're not supposed to be. Nothing wrong with retooling. Retooling is basically, there's nothing wrong with the plane, but they retool and upgrade. There's various parts of a plane they upgrade. Most passenger planes that we fly on, passenger jets, passenger aircraft, most of those retire after 25.2 years. But within that 25-year period, there's a lot of retooling. You know, you're not sitting on those same seats. I know it feels like it for 25 years. Every few years, they retool. There are parts of the computer systems that are retooled. There are parts of the entertainment system that are retooled. There's a lot of retooling. And so I talked to a leader recently who has been on the mission field for a number of years, and he felt it was time to retool. He wasn't retiring, but he's landing the plane to retool to take off again. That's what Every Nation Seminary is all about, helping ministers of the gospel retool kind of mid-career, kind of in the middle of, I've been serving, this tool's been working, I need to upgrade. So we refuel, we redirect, we retool. Nothing's wrong with any of those. But then there's repair. There are times when planes need to repair. They either land to repair, and there's something wrong here. There's something wrong. If we keep going when we need to repair, then we put a lot of people in danger. And so look, if you need to repair, if there's something broken emotionally or mentally or relationally or whatever, landing to repair is not only okay, it's necessary. To continue on when something's broken is not only unwise, it's irresponsible, and it's extremely dangerous to the leader's soul and to the souls of the people who look to that, not pilot, but that pastor for leadership and for care. And then there is the idea of retirement. So we can refuel, redirect, retool, repair, and then there's retire. I've been reading lately a lot about retired airplanes, and you don't want to know all of that, but I'll just give a little bit of a summary of it. All over the world, there are places, they call them aircraft boneyards. We're going to talk about one in Arizona. They're typically in deserts, partially because of the dry climate. There are over 4,000 retired passenger jets in an Arizona desert. There are also some in California, in the States, in Mississippi, in Arkansas, in Michigan. Then there are various other nations in the world have their places. There are over 1,000 of the large jets that are retired around the world every year. So there'll be another 10,000 10 years from now. But right now there's 4,000 in this desert in Arizona. But it's a very costly process to retire a plane. But what happens is this, and I'll get to this, important for all of us who are considering the idea of landing for whatever reason and even landing for retirement. But even in retirement, there was one article that said that 90% of a retired plane's parts are still reusable. They're repurposed, they're refurbished, and they're put back into action. Not that we're going to let pastors retire and then we're going to kind of dissect them and use parts, but I think the metaphor would say there's a lot we can still do even if we do get to a retirement part. When it comes to retiring from a job, again, we still don't retire from a calling or a gifting or a stewardship before God. And so we might still be 90% needed for others who are just now taking off. So that, I hope that's encouraging. So when we think about the idea of finishing strong, the idea of thinking about leadership transition, thinking about how to make room for next generation leaders, how to think about the runway so we're not crashing in experienced leaders and emerging leaders. We clear the space so they can take off and soar. We still have a role to play. We still have a part to play, but I want to get back and I want to end with the thought from what the Apostle Paul was writing to the church at Ephesus. So many of Paul's letters really did, if you think about succession planning and leadership transition, the Pentateuch is all about that. I mean, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, I mean, you read that and so much of that is about multi-generational failures, multi-generational successes, and leadership passing from one generation to the next. We see that all through the Old Testament. We see that whole idea really is what the Gospels play out. Jesus finding those next people, preparing them for a leadership transition, sending the Holy Spirit and all that. You can see it all through, and you see it in Paul's letters. Almost every letter Paul wrote had the principles of succession planning and leadership transition, because they all knew that this is a multi-generation, multi-century, multi-millennial thing going on here, and nobody leads forever. Everybody at some point is not going to be in the position they're in right now. And so we have to prepare for it. We have to think about it. And so when we think about it, it's not that we're now useless and we have no more purpose or calling or any role. That's not it. I hope that's been clear. But as we're approaching that, as we're thinking about that, no matter what age or stage we are, let's think of the words of Paul. Therefore, as a prisoner for the Lord, I urge you to walk worthy of the calling. As you're getting ready to land, walk worthy of the calling. Then he says this, with humility. And sometimes that's difficult when someone is a very experienced leader and there's an upstart emerging leader who's a know-it-all. Still, do it with humility, with gentleness, patience, bearing with one another, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. As established leaders, as experienced leaders, it's on us to walk out our calling all the way to the end by being humble and patient and gracious, building unity, building peace. Why? Because that honors God. That pleases God. The same way we wanted to please Him from the beginning, we want to please Him at the end. And I hope that helps think biblically about the idea of, at some point, I will not be leading in the position I'm leading in now. And how do we go about thinking about that and living through that in a way that pleases God and advances His kingdom? I hope that helps. God bless you.